Good afternoon. I'm very glad to welcome you to this activity at the School of Languages of UNESCO Chair in Political Linguistics for Multilingualism. And Rachel Sutton-Spence is accompanying us today from Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina. On deaf literary norms for translation. No, deaf literary norms for translation. You still don't see it in the screen, but you will see the title very soon. I'm going to introduce you very briefly. Rachel Sutton, so she has the time for her talk, and then you have some time for questions. Rachel Sutton-Spence has been a teacher and researcher in the Department of Brazilian Sign Language, Libras, at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil, since 2013. She has been engaged in sign language research since 1989 in the Center for Deaf Studies at the University of Bristol, and has published on linguistic and sociolinguistic aspects of British Sign Language, co-authoring in English The Linguistics of British Sign Language in 1999 with Ben C. Wall. Her current research interests are in sign folklore and creative signing, including sign humor, poetry, and narratives. In 2016, she published, also in English, Introducing Sign Language Literature, co-author with Michiko Kaneko. In 2021, she published Literatura em Libras in Portuguese, focusing on literature in Brazilian Sign Language, published as a bilingual text in Portuguese and Libras, a book that she may present us in the future in these activities. So in this talk, Deaf Literary Norms for Translation, she will consider the elements of sign language and deaf culture that determine the acceptability of literary translations, where one of the languages is a visual-spatial-kinetic sign language of a deaf community. Looking at some examples of sign language literature, we will ask, or she will ask, in what she is going to deliver, what are deaf literary norms? What translation norms do we need to follow to produce a quality literary translation for members of the deaf community? Maybe a topic we hadn't very much thought about. So we are very grateful with Rachel that wanted to communicate as her knowledge. And I can advise those who are in YouTube that you can activate transcription. And it's all yours, the microphone, Rachel.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I've probably set too much for us to talk about, but it will be fun anyway to talk about what we can in the next half an hour, 40 minutes, maybe. I will try to speak slowly because I know that most of you, almost probably all of you, will be working in your second language, and I'm lucky to be working in my first language today, which is unusual for me. It's very, very nice. Before I start sharing my screen, I'd just like to ask anybody either here in the Zoom room or on YouTube, if anybody has experience already of any sort of literary translation in sign language, any sign language. Is there anybody who has experience, who's already done some, or is this a new area? Any replies from people? You can say no, or you can say yes.
Maybe Santiago can answer.
Lady Laura has no experience. Okay, I'm going to assume that people don't have experience, and we'll take it from there. So are you seeing, I hope you're seeing my screen clearly. Yeah, okay. So this is what I want to talk about. I want to ask this question about what are the literary norms that we understand when we're thinking about translating either from sign language into a spoken or written language, or from the written and spoken language into the sign language, but thinking particularly about this fact that we are dealing with a linguistic and cultural phenomenon of the deaf community. And we'll have a look at a couple of very brief examples of, I hope, of sign language literature, and just so that you just get the simplest idea of what it looks like. And then we'll think about some of the elements that we need to think about for translating in either way. So before I start talking about my talk at all, I would just like to, I hope, share with you, it's a very simple children's story in sign language, and it's about a cow, a deaf cow, who is wearing high heels. So in this particular story, it's aimed at very young deaf children. So it's somewhere between an early years story and perhaps we might think a nursery rhyme, but it's not traditional. It's made up very recently by a member of the deaf community. So what I'd like to do is share that with you now, if I can. No, that's not working. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I'll talk you through what it is. No, I won't. I'll let you watch it the first time. I'll just let you watch it. So it's a deaf cow who is wearing high heels. And I'm going to show it to you again. I hope you noticed that in all of this, hang on, stop share just for a moment. I hope you noticed in all of those that this hand shape was used throughout the entire story. She never used any other hand shape but this. So this is the hand shape for a cow. It's the hand shape for a sign high heels. It's the hand shape for an aeroplane that flew over. It's the hand shape for fat, because the cow is very fat. It's the hand shape for a mobile phone. It's not quite the hand shape for hello, which is hello, but it's close enough that she kind of just manages to squeeze it in. And obviously she's walking with her high heels and she keeps falling over and standing up again. Those signs are placed in different areas of the signing space. The signer, you'll also notice, has become the cow. So her facial expression, her movements, her eye gaze are all meant to be the facial expression, movements and eye gaze of the cow. And it's all quite exaggerated because it's meant to be funny, and there's plenty of research to say that children love it when animals are personified, when animals take human characteristics. So all of that is why this, I think, ought to be a good story. What I'd like to do is show it again now, show the same thing, the same video, just now that you know that that's what it is, and then we'll watch it through again. So now I just have to work out how to share the screen again. So there's a cow with eyelashes and long floppy ears, and she's chewing the cud. She goes for a walk in her high heels, walking along very heavily, but in her high heels, and she sees an aeroplane overhead as she's walking, and she falls over. So she stands up again, and her phone rings. Oh, hello! And she falls over. She stands up again. She's walking along, feeling very pleased with herself, and falls over in the mud, and she's a cross cow. So that's one example of so many. We could spend the whole time just watching examples, but that's not what we're talking about. It was just an example. So I think when we think about what idea of literature is here, it's something that is recorded in some permanent way. So it's a language art form that is recorded in some sort of permanent written form. And the first clay block that we've got there is the Epic of Gilgamesh from 5,000 years ago, and it's written. That's why we've got it. We go through Greek, we go through Latin, and we go through all sorts of old texts. And the idea of having these texts is that they're written. And we have this fixed idea, I think, first of all, that literature is something that can be written, but also it's something that can be translated. So these are two things that I want to emphasize with the slide that I'm showing. So we've got Fausto in Portuguese, but originally from German. We've got things that are translated from French, from Russian. So we're used to the idea that things are written, and we're used to the idea that we can translate literature in some way. When we think about deaf literature, some people are even surprised that such a thing exists. I just need to tell you, yes, it does. Deaf literature exists, and it is, you see it in any deaf community anywhere around the world. Some of it is more recognized, some of it is more carefully planned, some of it is more established in educational establishments. But you will find, and these examples that I hope you can all see here, looking at these, I hope you can see that there's a man here in a red t-shirt who's got a yellow background. He's telling a joke. The lady in the blue shirt here, she's telling a story of a true story that somebody told of their childhood a long time ago, but it didn't happen to her. This is the story of some other deaf person and that deaf person's experience. This man here is telling a story of his own experience as a child. These narratives of personal experience, as we call them, are a very important part of deaf literature, and we'll come back to that. Here, the man who's standing with some trees behind him, the black and white photograph, he is telling a folk story from Brazil, but in Libras. This man is telling here with, again, another sign for a cow. Here he's telling the story of the frog and the ox, the fable, the Aesop fable. And this last one is a poem, it's a duet poem. And these are just some examples of the very rich diversity of deaf literature. These are all sign language examples from Brazilian Sign Language, but every country has them. So the other thing that I would ask is what we're thinking about. Why are we even going to do a literary translation? What are our aims and objectives in doing this? And from the current research that we have, one of the examples that we have here is that it should be for enjoyment. I think generally that the whole point of literature is that it's something for enjoyment. It's an opportunity at some level to play with language, and it's something to give pleasure to the readership, to the audience. And if the translation of the text, if the text was aiming to give pleasure and the translation doesn't give pleasure, one of the very unfortunate things, you do a translation of something and a deaf person says, oh yeah, I understand. And you think, no, I didn't want you to understand it. I want you to smile, or I want you to laugh, or I want you to be angry, or to be informed or something. But oh, I understand. That's kind of the base level. Yeah, of course you want somebody to understand, but what you want is more than that. You want somebody to understand and to enjoy. In sign language, a lot of the question is it about accessibility? Are we saying to deaf people, it's a challenge for you to read in the written language of your own country because it's your second language, and a lot of deaf people find it very difficult to read fluently in the written language of their own country, which is why we're thinking about this. So are we just doing it so that they can have accessibility? Conversely, perhaps you are a hearing person who doesn't know any sign language. Do you just need to know what this story is about? For example, perhaps you're a hearing teacher with a deaf child and you want to know what's the text about. It's simply about accessibility. The whole idea about education is the idea of literary translation just so that the deaf student has access in some way to a literary form, to a literary work? Or is it perhaps the whole point of a translation, a literary translation, is it for us to do some research? Is it for us to explore different ways of how we could translate a text? So these are all things that we might be wanting to think about. And so the other side of that coin, I think, is to ask, who is this translation for? And sometimes it's for the translator. It's an exercise that the translator does so that they can practice translating. And there's a lot of work in universities where translators are practicing translating, and that's fine. But I think if we're talking about going from the written language to sign language, which is very common, then we do need to be aware that this is for a deaf audience. I say audience, readership. It's difficult to think, do you read a video or do you watch it? I don't know. But these could be deaf students, so younger deaf people, or they could be deaf teachers, perhaps. So these are deaf teachers teaching deaf students so that they can teach the same lesson that hearing teachers do. Or is it for a hearing audience? Is it for hearing students or hearing teachers who perhaps are wanting to learn sign language and wanting to know more about sign language literature? So again, it's a question of who are you translating for, because we're thinking about this for the translation norms. At a similar sense, is it perhaps, if we do these translations, is it something that is a benefit to deaf poets, to deaf literary artists, deaf storytellers? If you think about developing how a hearing author will develop their work, of course they'll read books in their own language, but I'm sure many of you read books translated. That's, as I said in this first slide, we were looking at it, we read books in translation. Why shouldn't deaf authors do the same thing so that the deaf poets and literary artists themselves can develop their ideas, can think, I've never, for example, experimented with a haiku form, say the Japanese haiku form of poetry. I'll see translations. All right, I'll try that in my own sign language, for example. And again, coming back finally, maybe this literary translation is for research purposes. We're doing it because we're trying to try out new ways of translating and of doing literary translation. I said at the beginning that what we're talking about is a translation of an art form that belongs to a deaf community, a community of people. And if we're going to do a translation, I think we need to think about deaf culture. And when we're thinking about deaf culture, what we're asking essentially is, how have deaf people experienced the world? Through a visual experience, through touch and sight, and not so much about sound. So every single deaf person has an experience of the world that is filtered through the fact that they're deaf, that their world experience is essentially a visual world experience. So there's that side of things. But if you're just one person, you've got your experience. But for real culture, you need to know about other people's experience of this world. So what Ben Bahan, who is an American deaf researcher, what he's suggested is that basically deaf culture is this bringing together of individual deaf experiences of the world with the knowledge of the world experience of other deaf people in their community, deaf people in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world, deaf people who've gone before, all that bringing together its experience and knowledge of the world as seen by a deaf person. Now, obviously, when deaf artists produce deaf literature, they are drawing on their own deaf experience and they're drawing on their knowledge of their deaf world. If you're a translator, then that's going to come into it. If you are a hearing translator, you will be drawing on your own experience as a hearing person and your knowledge of the hearing world and of hearing literature, but you're also going to have to draw on this knowledge of other deaf people's experience and other people's knowledge of the deaf community so that you can bring your translation towards deaf culture. And obviously, as we're saying, if you're going to have this knowledge of other deaf people's experience, you're going to get that from other deaf people. So deaf people pass their culture on to other deaf people. Older deaf people pass it on to younger deaf people from one community pass it on to deaf people in another community, and so on. And this means that when we see deaf literature, this is a way that deaf artists are passing their knowledge on. When we translate that deaf literature to hearing people, we're passing deaf culture to hearing people so that hearing people can understand what deaf people want to know. And when we translate hearing people's literature into, I put here Libras, but into any sign language, we're opening new paths for deaf culture. So what we're doing is we are opening everything up to share the knowledge of people's experience, deaf people's and hearing people's experience. I'm coming back now just briefly to say, are there any questions? Is this okay? Are you following? Do you want me to go slower, faster? Do you think anything differently?
Can I ask something, Rachel? Is this deaf literature also written?
Yes, deaf literature is written. We've got two choices. We can write it in sign language, and I can show you an example of that later on. There is a written form of sign language. There is a way of writing sign languages. In Brazil, it's fairly well developed, but it's still not particularly well known. And in many countries, people won't think of it as a viable form. Most deaf people think that their sign language literature is something that happens live in the body, as we saw with the deaf cow. That's kind of how people produce literature. Those photographs I showed you, those images of the different people signing different stories and poems and jokes, that's how people expect it. deaf people do write literature in the language of their host hearing community. So in Colombia, there may be deaf people who write in Spanish. In Brazil, deaf people who write in Portuguese. In England or the United States, deaf people who write in English, because many deaf people are bilingual. I'm obviously, that too could be translated from one written language to another, but that's not particularly what I want to follow here, because I think it has more interesting things about deaf norms and deaf literary norms and translation. But yes, it is written, and you can either write the sign language or you can write the spoken language, both of them talking about deaf people's experience, either individual experience or the experience of the deaf community. If there are any other questions, if you want to post them on the chat, that's fine too, and I'll look at them, but otherwise I'll go back to sharing my screen again, if I can find it. That one. So I think, so this is coming really to the main point. So how are we going to approach any translation of deaf literature? Thinking about what are the literary norms already of that deaf community. So we're asking ourselves, hang on, I just had a thought. Wait a minute. No, that doesn't work. I'm thinking how to share the screen. As I was doing it before, did that work? Doing this? I hope it does. So first of all, how we should approach the translation of deaf literature by thinking, what are deaf people expecting of deaf literature? So deaf people know what they expect from a story, from a joke, from a poem in sign language. And if we're going to do that translation, we need to know what their expectations are. It isn't enough to know what the hearing literary norms are, because it's from a different society, a different culture, a different community. We need to know both sets of literary norms so that we can do a translation accurately, or provide at least the pleasure, which is what I'm trying to emphasize. The other question is, what translation norms do we need? Because we need to know the literary norms, and when we've done that, we then need to think, well, what norms are we expecting from the translator? And I've put here this word translator actor, because as you saw, when Marina, she's called Marina, who was telling the story of the deaf cow, when Marina is telling that story, it's not enough to translate it, you have to act it out. And any translator, anybody who presents sign language literature at some level is a kind of actor as well. So we need to think about, you're not just producing something that is a piece of language work, you're also producing something that is a performance. And that, again, is a different set of norms that we would think about. So we probably need to think about how we can understand and use playful use of language. A lot of people who learn sign language, one of the last things that they learn is the ludic side of things. There's not much focus on playful language. And when we think about a lot of literature generally, there is a playful use of both form and meaning. So it doesn't really matter whether it's the spoken language or the sign language, we need to know how to deal with those challenges. We need to deal with different dialects. We need to know, the third point here, knowledge of members of the deaf community and hearing people. We need to know what deaf people already know, and we need to know what hearing people already know and what assumptions we can make. And this point here, Christopher Stone did his doctoral work on looking at what the translation norms are of deaf translators and how they different from hearing translators, all working in sign language. And what Stone found was that the deaf translators have a very clear idea of what they expect the deaf community to already know when they do these translations. So what implications does a piece carry? What's implicit? What needs to be made explicit? And so it's not enough just to say, well, I've translated it. If the deaf community, if the members of the deaf community don't understand what it is you've just translated, because they don't have the background knowledge to be able to make sense of it enough to enjoy it. So you need to know, first of all, what deaf members of the deaf community want, need, and know, and you need to know what the literary norms are. You also, I think you also need to know what is your role as a literary translator actor. What do you do? How far do you go? And that's something that we'll talk about in a minute. I can see that we haven't got that much time. I'm going to jump these two. Oh no, I'm not, because I think it's quite important. I'm going to go back, but I'll try and be brief. Just briefly about the difference between a literary translation and a literary interpretation, because we can go in both directions, as I said. The most common form of literary translation is still to go from the spoken language to the sign language. And that's most common. And ironically, it's most done by hearing people, even though unusually they're going from their first language into their second language, because most hearing people aren't native signers. Some are, if they've grown up in deaf families, they are. But most members of the translation interpretation community are first language, spoken language, second language, sign language, and yet they're still going from from spoken language to sign language. What we're trying to do is to encourage deaf people for whom the sign language is their first language to get more involved in this literary translation, because they're the ones who have this in-depth knowledge of the sign language that they're translating into. But there is also the idea of translating from the sign language to the spoken language. It's not very common, it's not done very much, and there isn't very much research on it. But it's worth thinking that we are looking at literary translation in both directions. And obviously, it being a translation, it can be done in advance. But one of the things that we can do when we do literary translation is that we can present both things simultaneously. So, for example, you can publish a video and it's got subtitles. So when that happens, sorry, we live on a flight path. I hope the aeroplanes aren't too I'll just wait. So one of the things that happens is you can see what you're seeing the sign language, which as it's visual, people can often get a lot of information from the performance element, and then you can read the source text and see the two simultaneously, which you can't see when you've just looking at a book or something like that, because you can't see the signing, and you can't see the translation. So that's a very different thing. When you're interpreting, it may be translated in advance or not. It might be live, it might be recorded. But the thing that we need to say about this is that if something's happening where there is you can see the performance and you can hear the performance, hearing audiences can see what the deaf person is signing, the deaf artist is signing, and they can hear the interpretation simultaneously. So you've got this kind of taking it in with the eyes, taking it in with the ears at the same time, and they can put the two together. Whereas a deaf audience is only going to see the signed interpretation and they can't hear the spoken work. So this is something that we need to consider. I've seen that there's a question, and I'll come to it in a minute. I just want to do this particular slide, and then I'll come back to a question about metaphor. So the other thing, we need to think about the linguistic translation norms, and we need to think about the cultural translation norms. But then there's these other non-linguistic translation norms that we need to think about. So, for example, the theme. what we've chosen to translate, is this content even accessible to the deaf community? Is it enjoyable for deaf audiences? Do the audiences want this translation? Often they say, oh, we're going to translate this for the deaf community. And the deaf community say, well, thank you, but I'm not actually interested in that. I don't want to know about that. So again, if you're thinking I'm doing this for deaf people, finding these, finding out what themes, what content deaf people even want, is that the responsibility of the translator? I would argue that in this case, it probably is. And that's something that it's worth thinking about. Why am I translating what it is that I'm translating, and how am I going to make this content accessible? Are we going to have subtitles or not? Are we going to use multiple images? Are we, for example, going to have an image of the signer and next to them some pictures? These visual images and sign language, for example, in children's literature, there is often an illustration with a text. Are we going to show both when we're doing this in sign language? Are we going to have, how big is the interpreter on that screen? Often the interpreter is very small compared to the text, and I'll show you an example in a minute if we've got time, because it does send important messages as to the value of the sign language. If most of the screen is taken up with written text and there's a very small signer, what does that say about the relative status of the two languages, which I think is worth thinking about? The question of the people, what's the profile of the artist? What's the profile of the translator? Is the artist deaf? Is the artist hearing? Is the translator deaf? Is the translator hearing? Is the translator a child? Is the artist a child? Are they, what race are they? Are they black? Are they white? Are they native indigenous of the country? Where are they from? These things can have a great impact, particularly with the translator, because you can see them. Is this person a woman or a man? Well, looking at them, I can probably tell. And that's not something you can do when you're just reading a translation. And that does have an impact, and it's worth thinking about that. How long or short is this translation going to be? Deaf literary norms are that usually a piece is no more than 3 or 4 minutes long. How do we accommodate longer pieces from a text into a shorter signed text? Do we adapt it? Do we abridge it? Do we just divide it into smaller sections? And then the question of genre. Are we going to change genre when we do a translation? If it's a poem, are we going to translate it as prose? If it's a piece of prose, how are we going to, is it something that we can make more theatrical from the performance perspective? So things like that are important to think about. And because we've got almost very little time left, I just want, so this, for example, this is an education text, and you can see that it's cordel literature, which is a type of Brazilian folk poetry. But we can see here, this is educational. So the idea is to give access for deaf students who are studying cordel in high school. But when we look at that, we can see that 2/3 of the screen is in Portuguese. It's emphasizing all the time the written text, and the interpreter, who does a great job, it's a lovely translation that he does, he's been squeezed over into just 1/3 of the text. And I think it's worth us thinking about that. What's the message that that sends? That here's something nominally for deaf people, privileging sign language, and then making it that much smaller than the written text. So that was something that I just wanted to show you. We could add images. So here are some examples of a translation that the translator has added images to the background and he's put icons in. Just to go back to Marcia's question, she asked about writing the sign language. So here is an example. So the poem, this is basically the poem written down in the sign language. So it's not a text, it's not a translated text, it's a transcribed text in sign language. And this was work by Ricardo Barros, where this is a poem, originally a concrete poem, originally written in sign language. And all these little images that go around in a circle, they're all sign writing saying deaf. The eyebrows are all saying sign language. And these ones are interspersed saying deaf hearing, deaf hearing, deaf hearing. So the idea is what makes a happy deaf community, sign language and deaf people together, all encircled by the deaf community. So you can do some quite interesting things with the translation. But I'm going to stop sharing now because I've seen that it's 10:02. There was a question that I saw, and I've now lost on the chat, that the question is, one of the most difficult things to translate to and from sign language are metaphors. Any tips on how to teach students to deal with them? First of all, I would say, ask yourself how much you want that metaphor to come through. At what level is this metaphor? So, for example, if we're thinking about, is the entire text a metaphor? Then when that happens, then we need to be thinking to ourselves, okay, how do I signal to the deaf community that this is a metaphor? And often it's not obvious. There are some very good sign language texts that are metaphors of something else. And if you discuss it with people, and oh, right, yes, I get that. That may or may not be the translator's task. So if you're talking about, for example, fables, to a certain extent, a fable is a type of metaphor. And you get to the end, and that's when you get the explanation of what was the story about. And I think that can be added. This is what I was saying about, you need to think, what does the deaf community know? What does the deaf community expect? If they're not expecting it to be a metaphor, I've seen examples. There's a quite a famous, somewhere between a story and a poem, called The Little Ping Pong Ball. You know, the ball that bats back and forth. And the signer starts by saying, this is a metaphor. You work out what you mean by it, but this piece is metaphorical. So he, as the presenter, is saying it's a metaphor. So that's one thing. If you're talking about idiomatic metaphors, like, or I can only think of Portuguese examples. Cara de pau, so somebody who's got a wooden face is somebody who is being insolent. So you just have to presumably unpack the meaning and reproduce it if you know that metaphor. But if you know your deaf literary norms, you may not be transferring a particular metaphor over, but the more you study how, for example, hand shape carries metaphor. So, for example, on the whole, that hand shape or that hand shape or that hand shape is positive, whereas that hand shape or that hand shape or that hand shape or that hand shape carries negative connotations. Now, if you know that you've got those options, you can create negative connotations by choosing signs with a particular hand shape. We know that things that are higher up have metaphorical status that is higher, better, more positive than things that are lower down. So you can place things in signing space up and down. Things that are closer to the body are more wanted. Things that are further from the body are less wanted. So you can use your space to carry those metaphors as well. The crucial thing, I think, is to ask at what level you want to show that, at what level do you want to show that metaphor? Is it actually relevant, or are you saying that the readership in the spoken language is really enjoying the thrill of this metaphor because they are culturally expecting it? It's a norm, it's a literary norm that they are going to look for a metaphor. Whereas it could be that to get a similar sort of pleasure, it's not finding an equivalent metaphor, it's producing an equivalent beautiful visual pleasure. So you produce a visual sign that is more entertaining, that is more elegant. So you are giving the same pleasure to both audiences. The hearing audience, who is used to those hearing norms, is getting it through a metaphor, and the deaf audience is getting it through a strong, powerful visual image. And that, I think, those are the things that I would suggest. But I would think particularly, I would ask you, why do you want to translate that metaphor? Do you think, oh, well, they need to know there's a metaphor here? They may not. They may not. But it's worth saying that if you are thinking about giving aesthetic pleasure through a translation, it could be that the metaphor itself isn't relevant. You've identified that's what gives the pleasure. Now I want to create something equally as pleasurable in the sign language. How am I going to do it? Kate, if you want to come back to me on that, put something on the chat. Santiago has said, in Brazil, in order to advance in the development of translation standards of deaf literature, it was necessary to have a base of translation standards. Was it necessary to have a base of translation standards in sign language in other fields, such as academic or legal? I think any advances in translation studies in sign language is going to help. I think what we've been trying to do in Brazil is to say you can have translation standards in academic fields, in legal fields, and that will advance what's going on. But we have to be aware that simply applying those to deaf literary translation isn't going to be enough, because what you're going to get at the end, I fear, or it's a very real possibility, that you will get an audience who says, oh, yes, right, I understand. And in the academic field, in the legal field, that's important. You don't want a legal field, a legal interpretation translation, where the deaf person says, I still don't understand. Actually, you might, but that's because it may be that it's not your job as a translator to make them understand, but it's to make it clear. But I think what we're looking at when we get to, if we apply that unthinkingly or completely or faithfully to the literary translation field, we're going to miss out on this idea of the aesthetics and the pleasure. So I think it is necessary to have a base of translation standards, but we need to be careful. For example, what do we mean by fidelity? And what is it that's the priority? If the priority in, for example, academic or legal is making sure that the terminology is equivalent, I don't think that's the same in literary translation. We don't need to standardize literary terminology when we translate something aesthetically. We don't need to say, if you want something positive, always use this handshake. You might use something in higher space. You might use a particular incorporation in the body. So yes, Santiago, I agree with you that having a base of translation standards in other fields is important. And I think we can perhaps even point to them and say, look, we've got these standards. Now let's think what the literary translation standards are as well. So the fact that there exist these norms, that this work that Christopher Stone did to say deaf people do know what needs to be passed on in different contexts, and we just add, okay, there's academic, there's legal, there's literary, there's educational. At what stage do I explain things? At what stage things do I just let you enjoy it?
So I ask Hector, are there any questions in YouTube? If not, I have a question for Rachel, just to finish. Rachel, you know, one thing that keeps me thinking since we started this project at the School of Languages of starting sign language, you know, Santiago is the one who's helping us to go on with this project and to start it. It's the first time that we have a full-time professor for sign language at the School of Languages and at the university.
And congratulations to the university for understanding how important that is.
We're very happy. We're really, really happy. I saw all that in Brazil, and I thought it was extraordinary. Rachel, one thing that calls my attention: why not give access to literature, to classical literature, for deaf people? Do you think there's things in the written language that they couldn't perceive, they couldn't understand, they couldn't apprehend in this universe of deaf people?
Yes. The education of deaf people has been centuries of mismanagement, misunderstanding. It's just been bad. Deaf education has not been good enough for deaf people. That's the first thing. It's also extremely difficult if you're a deaf person to become fluent in a written form, because you think, oh, well, it's visual, you can see it. But because it is so sound-based, it's actually very difficult to learn to read and write not using sound. So for a lot of deaf people, it is a struggle, a challenge to read long text. Some people can do it, and there's some very good research, often done by deaf researchers, asking not why do so many people have difficulty reading, but actually asking why do some deaf people manage to read very well. And when you know why some deaf people read well, we can try and help apply that to the deaf people who are struggling. But it is extremely difficult. And this means that for many deaf people, there's no pleasure in reading literary texts. And this is what I'm trying to, this is my particular take on things, because I think if you don't enjoy the literature, why are you reading it? You've got to get this sense of satisfaction out of it. Now, there's been some very nice research work done with translating texts that are set for study of American high school students, set in English, translated into American Sign Language. So the deaf students watch it in American Sign Language and then discuss the literary concepts. So, for example, going back to Kate's question, the metaphors, what's the motivation behind the characters? What's the what are the plot complexities, which are important concepts that you can discuss in any language. But if you're constantly being blocked by your challenge of understanding the written text, it becomes very difficult. So one of the reasons that people at high school level, particularly, that people could be translating these texts, and it needs to be done extremely well, to provide those texts in sign language so that the students can discuss the ideas such as metaphors or motivation or character development or whatever, which they're perfectly capable of doing if they have access to what's going on in the stories. And with that can then feed in, this is sort of Evan Zohar's idea, that you can learn from one culture, one community, from their literature, in your own literature, by seeing what they've written, taking it and adapting it to your own. But if you don't have access to that literature, it's very difficult to do.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So you think a good project would be, for example, to start translating short stories into deaf language?
Yes, I do.
Making videos of short stories?
And I'll tell you why I do, because they're short, and because they often encapsulate all these literature things. But as I was saying, you know, when I said, what are the non-linguistic norms that we need to consider? I really think it's important to discuss with the users, with members of the deaf community, what do you want? What translations do you want? I'm sure you all study the more market side of translation when you're involved in this, because a translator has to be paid. And so there is the whole market element of translation. This is not the case in sign language literature. There's no money in translation at all, but it's still worth asking, why are we doing this translation? It's not going to make us any money. If we're going to apply for funding so we can do these translations, we need to be sure that this is something that the deaf community wants, needs, is interested in, will enjoy, will benefit from, rather than just saying, oh, we all love this short story, you're going to love it. And then translate it, and the deaf people go, oh yeah, I understand. Yeah. So that's what you think. Oh, okay, which is fine at one level. But if it's on the other hand, is something, oh, that's really important. Now I understand what it is that everybody's talking about. These shared cultural ideas that people have, which I think is important, because, you know, that's what literacy is about. I think at one level, literacy is everybody having a shared, you know, people know in the UK, I don't know whether it's the same in Colombia, I assume it is, what people mean when they talk about a hare and a tortoise, or a rabbit and a tortoise. You know, the one ran ahead and fell asleep and the other one plodded on behind. That's a part of cultural literacy that comes from storytelling. If the deaf people don't have that, if they don't know who Cinderella was, if they don't know that the hare didn't manage to beat the tortoise in the race, then they've lost that. So that, I think that's really important, that goes on, that goes into, gets to the deaf community as well. But what else is for them to know? That's for, I think, for translators to have the discussion with the deaf community. I think that's very important. It's politically very important.
So, Rachel, thank you very much. I think we're left with a lot of desire to continue this approach to sign language, because I think we're just approaching, and I suppose we're going to have you again if you're willing to continue sharing with us all this enthusiasm for sign languages.
If you like to, we'll set something else up. If anybody has any other questions, Marta, you've got my email address. People can email me.
Okay.
So
thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope it's been useful to people.
Very much, I think very much, and we'll keep in touch. And thanks to the people who are here and who are in YouTube, and I'm sure we will hear you talking about this later on, and maybe in sign language next time. We can manage to organize the presentation in sign language.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me.
Thank you, Santiago.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for setting it up. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Ciao.